Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and I am joined by the one and only Father Deacon Dr. Ananias. How you doing today, sir?
Doing well. Good to see you guys. Good to be back on the show.
Hey,
it's good to be alive.
Exactly. I see you've been enjoying wintertime up in Montana. I've been hitting the slopes lately.
Yep. It's we've had some cold days. Today's actually pretty warm. And just blessed to have the snow and have a resort so close to me. I'll probably be after I start classes next week, and I might try to arrange it so that after class I can hit the slopes for a couple hours.
That's a heck of a work day.
Yeah, that's real tough.
Well, I'm definitely jealous. Over here in Indiana, it's pretty flat. So don't have any opportunity.
You have to do the cross-country skiing.
That's right, yeah. So I asked you to come on today to talk about metaphysics. Metaphysics is a deep and complex topic that I think is certainly useful for any Orthodox person, and especially somebody interested in apologetics, interested in arguments for God, and really the historical philosophical trajectory of how you talk about these abstract categories that are non-experiential in a way. We're not talking about matter. We're not talking about that which is observable. We're talking about a priori categories, and I think it's very difficult for a lot of people to grasp. So, some of the central themes we'll be getting into today is like ontology and identity and change. Space and time is a big one. Causality and effect, necessity and contingency, determinism and free will, numbers and universals, idealism and materialism, that type of stuff. So however you want to open up this conversation, I'm sure once we get going, we're going to go in a lot of different areas. Where would you like to start today?
Yeah, I think it's good to start with what metaphysics is not. So you'd already kind of touched on that. Metaphysics is not the section of the bookstore that you run into with the New Age astrology. By the way, I'll tell you this little joke. It was a true story, but when I was an undergraduate, and obviously I was single, I wasn't married at the time, and for all you guys out there, and I guess the ladies too, I mean, yeah, we kind of have an idealized kind of picture of like what, you know, the man or woman that you would like. And obviously I was into philosophy and theology and different stuff like that. And so I was always thinking, well, it'd be great to find an academic, erudite woman. Those are so hard to find.
Yeah.
But like you know, a good Christian academic woman that's into philosophy or some scholarly, that was kind of my thing. And so I used to spend a lot of time going to like Barnes and Noble or Borders and stuff like that. And you get your coffee and you get to walk around, you know, the different sections and read books. And there was this one time where it was, I'm walking over to the philosophy section and there she is, a beautiful girl. And I'm like, I can't believe that's actually what I wanted. A beautiful girl reading philosophy, and it's going to be so easy. So have you always been into Hegel? You know, whatever the line is. Like the pickup line would be like so easy. And then you realize that, oh God, she's in the metaphysics section. And she's like, what's your sign? I'm like, my sign is a bumblebee. She's like, that doesn't exist. I'm like, that's not real. I'm like, well, none of it's real. But that was always they would always in Borders or Barnes and Noble put the metaphysics section with all the tarot cards and the occultic stuff and New Age spirituality right next to the philosophy. And I'm like, why, God? Why? And it would drive me crazy. So let's start off by saying that is not what metaphysics is.
Right.
I don't know exactly how that came about or when that we started associating the term metaphysics with kind of New Age spiritualism. Maybe you'd probably know better than I would about, but it's drive me crazy ever since I got into philosophy.
Right. It's probably part of the sort of, you know, metaphysics really has, until the later half of the 20th century, has been a very pejorative, you know, type of thing. We're beyond metaphysics.
Yes.
You know, Sartre's existentialism really kind of characterizes much of the thought in the, you know, of the 20th century, really, until the later half. Quine, for example, and you could explain some of this, really breaking down the distinction between analytic and synthetic, reopens up the possibilities of metaphysics. And so maybe just the pejorative, well, metaphysics is spiritualism, you know, it's the New Age, it's the thing that's just beyond the physical world itself. But metaphysics, as we're going to be discussing today, is a very deep and complex, sophisticated, serious pursuit within philosophy itself. And I know,
and that's why women are not actually involved in. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, shots fired!
Just joking. I don't actually believe that.
No, of course not.
But what if I did? Would you judge me?
As a good Orthodox, of course not. I would never judge. So
yeah, but let's talk about
maybe a good
where
place.
This begins.
Yeah, maybe
let's begin at the beginning.
Yeah, Parmenides and so flux and change. Parmenides, for example, was really focused on the concept of ontology and being, and he posited that the world is a sort of fixed thing, where Heraclitus, in opposition, that the world is ever changing. And so take it from there as that's kind of the opening dialogue of what metaphysics starts with in the philosophical tradition, is almost Parmenides and Heraclitus. You know, what would you like to say with that?
Yeah, we could even define metaphysics as the study or science of first things, the first causes of things. And so, you know, those questions come up in the Pre-Socratics. So questions about what is everything made of, what underlies everything, what is motion and change? Does it exist? These different things. So they're the deepest kind of questions, aren't they?
Yeah.
The kind of fundamental structures of all reality and knowing. That's why they call it a science of first things, in the sense of like not first in order of your kind of like knowing and seeing and stuff like that, because you look out and you see, all this empirical stuff on the surface. That's not what metaphysics is. Metaphysics is to then push the question mark down all the way down to first principles, arches, and to, what explains it all? What's behind the scenes, the structures of reality. And that's going to include things exactly like you said about ontology, causality, motion, change, and things like that. And so that's really where it begins. That's what metaphysics. Now, you don't get the term metaphysics, listed or named as metaphysics in the Pre-Socratics. I don't think you get that until you get to Aristotle. And well, I've got my Aristotle book here has to be duct taped.
Wow.
Yeah.
You ever use that thing or?
Yeah, look at that, dude. Nobody has done Aristotle like justice like me. Look at this, all my notes, dude. Unless your book is falling apart and you have to duct tape it, you have not read Aristotle.
Oh my God. Yeah,
I could throw it away, but then all the evidence that I've actually studied Aristotle would be thrown out the window. So Aristotle wrote the physics, right? Physis, right? Nature, in which you're looking at motion and change in the physical world, right? And he writes 14, let's see, I think there's 14, I can't remember how many books are in there. I know there's 14 books in the Metaphysics. But the metaphysics, it's not a very creative title. It's ta meta ta physika, right? Mm-hmm. After the physical considerations in Greek. So it's like, hey, I finished my book, The Physics. What's your next album going to be? Aftermath. Call it Aftermath, right? This is playing up Dr. Dre, right? Like, what's your next label going to be called? Metaphysic, fool. It's just after the physics is so all those things, kind of like we were talking about, that beyond the physical considerations of motion and change, mm-hmm. and things like that, what is more fundamental? What becomes ontologically prior to that is kind of first things would be what we'd classify metaphysics. So historically, that's where we actually get the term metaphysics, mm-hmm. is with Aristotle, even though, as you'd mentioned, that the Pre-Socratics are engaged in metaphysics.
Right.
Anyways, I'll stop there. Ask any questions if.
No, that's great. So, is it fair enough then to say that even though Parmenides and Heraclitus certainly would never characterize what they're doing as metaphysical, and in fact Aristotle doesn't use that term. It's the whoever described his books titled it metaphysics.
Yes, it's probably a student.
Yeah, probably a student. And so maybe he did use that term, and that's in his teachings, but and that's where the student used that term. But maybe talk a little bit then. So Parmenides, again, being as such is a sort of fixed thing, and that the illusory perception of forms or things changing in the world is a sort of illusion, where Heraclitus is talking that things are actually a continual flow of being. And this is going to characterize as we move into post-Kant, because I really want to try to talk a little bit about the Pre-Socratics and then Aristotle, because really from Aristotle, metaphysics turns into theology up until Scholasticism, and then you start to go back to these sort of philosophical approaches to the subject, really outside the context of the presupposition of God and revelation and scripture and all this stuff. And then we get Descartes, where we really have the score, what is the absolute, skepticism? What is the thing that I can be skeptical, I cannot be skeptical about? And therefore we get the cogito ergo sum. And this is a new approach to metaphysics, and that leads eventually into Kant. Of course, we have Spinoza and Leibniz before him. And then with Kant and his a priori, a posteriori, synthetic, that this whole debate between the one or the other, he kind of brings together, brings German idealism into existence. And then we have the realism of the sort of Anglo-American, more empirical realism school versus the idealism school. And so it's almost like these dichotomies are consistent all the way through the sort of philosophical tradition. And then with Heidegger and his re-emphasis on being as such, he brings back the sort of importance of metaphysics, and he was very versed in Duns Scotus, who's a scholastic, very much interested in these concepts. So,
and he wanted to return back to the Pre-Socratics too.
Yeah, yes,
as well.
And so you have people like Nietzsche or even Sartre who want to totally dissolve metaphysics, and at the same time, Nietzsche's focus on the will itself is really a sort of metaphysical understanding of will and intentionality and all these different things that really get going in Husserl's school of phenomenology and all this different stuff. So before getting
the metaphysics could be characterized too, and I forget who the first one was that actually Avicenna. Avicenna said essence precedes existence.
Yes, I totally skipped Avicenna in the Muslim metaphysics.
The commentators on. Now, why that's important is it's kind of a nicely put way of expressing assent and positing metaphysics. This is what a metaphysics would be. You put essence first before existence. So the denial of metaphysics would be the kind of existentialist move that like Sartre, being in nothingness, existence precedes essence. There is no metaphysics, right? What's Sartre's thing? There's just being and nothing, right? There's nothing, right? There's no essence, and then you make, right? And all part of this comes out of the kind of will to power as well.
Right.
That if there are no fixed essences or anything like that, then there is will.
So before we move into the scholastic tradition, and really that's the whole philosophical tradition in the Western world, we have orthodoxy, and so we just do theology. But before that, after the schism, what is the metaphysics of, what is he interested? What's Aristotle trying to bring out of some of the pre-Socratics and of that Greek philosophical tradition, and talking about metaphysics per se? What is he interested in?
So the book Metaphysics here, you probably can't see the...
Yep, Metaphysica.
Yeah. Let's see. There are 14 books, so it's correct in that. I see. I at least remember something from here. It really is a science. What's the subject matter? So when we talk about a science, right? I don't mean like empirical modern sciences, but in the traditional kind of ancient way, a discipline that studies something. So you get the name of the science due to the subject matter that you study. So the science of number, magnitude, and stuff like that would be mathematics. The study of life, that subject matter would constitute the science of biology, etc. Well, what if your subject matter is being, qua being? That word is we used to like to joke, Aristotelian mating call. Qua. No, it means they use it so much, like Aristotelians use it so much that you think that it would be a mating call, right? It just means as. Qua is Latin for as. So being not as a book or as yellow, but being as being. So I'm not setting being in a particular mode, but in its general, most universal mode, as being. That would be being qua being. That is, for Aristotle, the subject of metaphysics, in that he identifies that as the first cause of all things, being. So, obviously, this already starts with Parmenides, and he's pulling from a lot from Parmenides, and Parmenides said his number one, his arche, his principle behind everything, of all reality and knowledge, that being is, and being cannot not be. So that's the fundamental explanation. So in some sense, Aristotle's picking up on the Parmenides enterprise there.
And related to the metaphysical philosophy of some of the ancient Greeks, we have Plato's Forms. The realm of the Forms is a sort of metaphysical statement about reality itself. You know, you and I are both sitting in chairs. The physical chair itself is less important than the idealistic form of chairs in its Platonic perfect sense. That is a metaphysical understanding of form that is very, very influential throughout the entire tradition of metaphysical philosophy. So I'm going to ask you then, can you speak to Aristotle? What is his conversation with Plato in regards to the forms? Because he has a very different approach to this. And then and then lead into Aristotle as the unmoved mover, because this is another important metaphysical question on causality of existence itself. If we're talking about being qua being, well, I am existing and the world is existing, but was there a first cause? I think these are two deep metaphysical sort of areas of discussion in some of the ancient Greeks.
Yeah, and so remember, part of the subject matter of metaphysics is the first causes of things. So whether it's Plato or Aristotle, when you're looking out in the world and you're asking, why is this the case? Why is the tree such and such? Why can we identify this tree with another tree and the name of tree and stuff like that? The answer from both of them is form. So form becomes part of metaphysics. And in fact, let's see, in the metaphysics, you actually do have treatments of that. As causes, book 3, the 4 causes, substance, which we're going to get into. Now, it's interesting. What's cool in Aristotle's metaphysics is that this is where you actually, almost all of our pre-Socratic fragments come from Aristotle's physics, book 1. Because here's where he goes into the successive recognition by earlier philosophers of the material, efficient, and final causes. Then the Pythagorean and Eleatic schools, right? Eleatic would be the Parmenides and Zeno, who denied change. The Platonic philosophy and criticism of pre-Platonic philosophers, criticism of the doctrine of ideas. So here's where he's just critiquing all this stuff, like saying whatever good stuff they got here, they didn't go far enough, something like that. But even with Plato, the idea of what is the forms is they're causes of things.
Right.
They're causes. And now it goes further than that, because if the realm of the forms and ideas is the realm of being, well, that's not enough each form is not enough to explain its own existence, right? So Plato goes to the form of the good that's beyond being, stuff like that. Aristotle will not do that. He will locate it, like Parmenides, in being itself. But being is, and you get this, what you were actually talking about. Being is one, like Parmenides says, And then I think it's book Lambda, where you get Aristotle talking about self-thinking thought and pure actuality. Like, so you get a definition of God is, and that's kind of what you were hinting at too.
Right.
This
well, and that's going
monadic.
to, as we move past or into scholasticism and even further, real fundamental metaphysical questions are God, the necessity. He's not contingent. He's necessary. Soul, again, as immortality of what is it that I'm moving through space and time. I'm David Patrick Harry. I'm moving through space and time. Am I the same? This is, again, identity and change. Am I the same person at every moment? Am I a different person at every moment? And concepts of soul is how we're going to understand maybe a timeless dimension of man himself. And then we have mind. What is mind? Where is mind? How do we understand mind? And you'll see that these questions of God, soul, mind, these are really going to be influential after scholasticism and these whole sort of skeptical approaches to metaphysics.
And substance too. That's important.
It's a big one. Yeah, essences, substances.
And then we'll get into. I mean, we could talk about it a little bit now, but because substance will be identified with forms, universals. This whole conversation too.
Yeah.
And you have in Plato, you have a theory of universals that's called realism. Aristotle does not believe that there are actual universals out in the world anywhere, that they're constructed within the mind. They're real in the sense that, but they only exist in the mind. And they have to actually be constructed from immaterial forms in nature that are abstracted and given kind of superior status within judgment within the mind or something like that. So he's kind of like a conceptualist. And then the third category is those who reject universals, and they would be nominalists.
Right.
So there are no universals either in the mind or outside of the mind. They're simply names. And so that falls into the category of metaphysics. So does terms like you'd already mentioned identity over time, events, processes, properties, change, things like that would all fall onto metaphysics as well. But substance is a very important conversation within metaphysics about what really exists, like what's a primary being. So, of course, you have things like qualities, or what the moderns would call secondary qualities, like yellow, hot, snub-nosedness, or something like that. But that's not what we mean by substance. Substance, substantia, in the Latin, standing under, right? Substantia, sub, under. And, there's the things that adhere in, and the things that is the real thing in which things adhere, other things adhere in. Mm-hmm. That's what a substance is. And then you look at the history of philosophy, and everybody's just defining like, well, this is what substance is. For Plato, the real thing is universals, abstract, right, immaterial, transcendent. For Aristotle, substances are going to be particular empirical things. But he's not a radical empiricist because he believes what makes matter has no reality in itself. So he's borrowing from Plato. You can't actually know matter. Neither can you say matter is real. Whatever sort of reality that it has, it's obtaining from the immaterial form. Right. The only difference is Aristotle believed that they weren't transcendent but immanent. They're in things.
Yes.
And so they're not two different things. That's exactly just what makes up a thing. A substance is form that's unchangeable, right? So we talked about this principle that the pre-Socratics were concerned with. Change in motion. Forms don't change. Forms are equated with being. So again, you have another. They are the causes of things. He agrees with Plato on that. They are the causes of the material things being the way that they are, and your ability to understand them and for them to have any sort of reality at all. So that again is what he calls he's a hylomorphist.
Yes, yeah. I was going to ask you to explain what hylomorphism is.
Yeah, morphe is form. Highly is matter. So what a thing is, it's not two things. It's two different kind of concepts, a way of looking at one thing. What is it made out of? It's made out of some type of materials. And what is it made into? The form. The form is what's the making. That's what a substance is. So it's form and matter. So not two different things that you bring together. They're two sides of the same coin that make one thing.
Yes. And
so, make sense?
Yep. Continuing that line of thought for people listening, because again, metaphysics, I'm sure for some people, they're like, what are these guys talking about? Can you speak then to substance, forms, and how this relates to the one and the many? We've talked about the one and the many concept multiple times, and how there must be some underlying thing, as you're saying, the root word for substance itself, that gives rise to the multiplicity of forms. So then we get back to the unity or oneness and multiplicity. Can you speak to that in regards to substance?
So again, the Pre-Socratics are already kind of touching on this stuff. You see many things, and yet even in your mind, you try to organize them under one category, right? We try to categorize under one thing. So that's kind of a already one in many that's going on. The search for an arche, a fundamental principle behind all reality, is to reduce the many to a one. Now, Plato is the first one in the Republic to actually kind of give a definition or a really concise example of the problem of the one and the many and his solution to it. And he says, I can't remember what book offhand is it. I could look it up later, but I have the quote memorized. We are in the habit, I take it, of positing a single idea or form, eidos, in the case in which we give one name to multiplicity, a multiple of things. So if you looked outside and you pick out multiple things, what is the one thing that you call them? Tree. Then you name the form. That's what you posit, or table or book or something like that. And so right there, you already have a concise kind of putting into words exactly what the one and the many actually is and what supposedly the solution to that is. So we're all interested in, but we have these different things. They look different.
Right.
We're making distinctions, yet we call them all one thing. So they're different and they're the same. Well, I need an explanation, a philosophical and metaphysical explanation of how can I say that they're different and how can I say that they're one? Now, Patrick, as you know and you do in your videos, this is really important when it comes to apologetics and worldviews, too. If you don't get this stuff sorted out, what happens? You get monism, right? Where it's all an illusion. It's all just collapsed into one. There are no distinctions. And if you follow those principles through, then you end up refuting oneself or contradicting or just being incoherent or something.
Right.
So that's why it's really metaphysics can be important, is that we get these things sorted out so that we can actually coherently make judgments and posit truth and these different things like that without refuting ourselves.
Yeah. So in regard to that skepticism, as you're talking about with your example of trees, that there's a multiplicity of trees out in the world, but we're using a single term, a single category to talk about treeness of all these different trees. Now, this is obviously a bridge of contention that some people, the more skeptical minded, will say, no, I'm seeing all these different kinds of things. And how are you telling me? Because you can't empirically show me how they're all trees, because I can also, I could show how they're all different. And so then you get into these categories we're using and this really gets into concepts of mind, of how is it that we're making truth claims about singularity or substance when my empirical experience of the world itself says these things are different.
Mm-hmm. And so that's what metaphysics is to ask the question, like a first things first. Well, if you're saying they're different or the same, you have to give an account for them. And it better be coherent and not self-refuting. So that's what metaphysics is attempting to do. So what Plato and Aristotle would say is that what makes these things the same, even though they're different, is they share in one form, the form of tree. Now, how they explicate why is one look different than the other or something like that, they'll have different explanations or something like that. Mm-hmm. But you see that they're appealing to something that's objective in both cases, even though they might part ways on exactly the ontological status and location of forms and universals. They're both objectivist, mm-hmm. Meaning those things exist, forms do, independent of the mind.
Yes.
And so I better get my mind corresponding with reality rather than, it's just my mind makes up these things. And again, this is going to be part of the problem in modernity when there's an abolition of objective forms, then everything is mind dependent in one sense, as far as this is where you kind of get the nominalism and different stuff like that they're going to have a really hard time actually. It's dependent upon the mind, the kind of categories and stuff like that, as far as, because there's nothing really out there to actually either make distinctions of difference or unity.
Right. And this is where Kant is going to talk about these a priori categories, such as space and time. So space and time, most people don't question the existence of these things. They think these are objective things outside in reality that is totally independent of my mind. But somebody like a Kant, he's going to make the criticism, no, things like space and time are actually mental categories for experience itself, that you mm-hmm. can't have experience. You can't occupy this sort of rational being without having these a priori categories of space and time. And so this is also part of a metaphysical debate on what is the reality of space and time. Are they out there in the world, or are they totally substantiated inside my own mind?
Yeah, exactly. So let me just look in the Metaphysics too, because Kant's pulling a lot from what Aristotle's done too, but part of your metaphysical consideration would be this is great. Philosophical Lexicon, book Delta, book 5. So these are all considerations. Kant's going to consider them too, in different ways, but this is what metaphysics would consider. Beginning, cause, element, nature, necessary, right? You already talked about necessity versus contingency. One and the many, chapter 6. Being, substance, the same, other, different, like, unlike, chapter 9. Opposite, contrary, in other species and in the same species. Prior, posterior. Potency, capable, incapacity, possible, impossible, 12. Quantum, 13. Look at that. Aristotle already come up with quantum theory, guys.
Well, we can even talk about that, how that is obviously positing a metaphysical answer to certain things, quantum physics itself.
I think quantum is he just means
no,
number.
I know that. Yeah. I meant modern quantum physics.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's just all a rehashing of the quality, relative, complete, limit, virtue, disposition, habit, affection, privation, from, part, whole, total. All these things are going to be part of metaphysics. These are kind of like, these are mental categories.
Yes.
Now, there might also be extra mental categories as well. But you see that Kant actually has not 10 categories, but 12.
Yep.
All subsumed under space and time, which you can reference in his Transcendental Aesthetic.
Yes.
And the critique of pure reason.
Right. And can you speak then how, as we're I would like to move kind of chronologically, how does orthodoxy?
By the way, did we get to the whole God? Did you have a question about the ancient Greeks kind of monadic God or something like that? I'm trying to remember. I don't mean to cut you off. But...
I think we were talking about monism, but which is kind of so again, go where you want to go. Maybe this is a good bridge into orthodoxy, because what I'd like to do then is talk about some of these metaphysical questions and how some of the early church fathers, how orthodox theology itself is answering things like substance or essence, where these forms come from. So again, as Orthodox, we have an understanding for Plato, the forms, the realm of the ideas, the pure idealistic realm is also a demiurge. Somehow it's created. It itself isn't, it is eternal, but it's created by the pure good. Well, Orthodoxy, we're going to be talking about the Logos. We'll be talking about the Word of God, and it is the sort of source of these archetypes, these archetypal forms that reality then builds itself upon. Again, in the beginning was the Word, so it creates the world through its own forms. Speak a little bit to then the monism of the ancient Greeks, and really they're tying monism to being itself because they believed the universe was eternal. And so if the universe is eternal, there is no beginning point, although some question that. Where we move into the Orthodox worldview, where we now do have a beginning point. Therefore, this contingent being of the created world is dependent upon some necessary being that has no beginning point. This is a major shift in thinking about causality and being and space and time and all these different categories. Could you speak a little bit to that? I know that was a lot there.
No, that was fine. Oh, that was well put. You're going to see these metaphysical assumptions. And then you're going to see a contrast with that with orthodoxy. But what you see and what we've talked thus far, especially with in antiquity and the ancient Greeks, are the metaphysical assumptions that oneness is perfection, and that multiplicity, oneness, and immutability are perfection, and that multiplicity and dunamis, change or the ability to change or something like that, potency, is imperfection. And that's why you get with Aristotle, God is the highest reality. So in his metaphysics, he considers that, and Aquinas is going to pick up on this as well. So he's just picking up on all Aristotle's arguments for the existence of God. That, well, look, what explains change, right? The Pre-Socratics are always wondering about that. Mm-hmm. Well, there has to be something actually hot or moving or in a particular state to make what's not in that state change.
Right.
So if you describe change is the water going from cold to hot, then how does that happen? Well, you have to have something actually hot making what's cold change into what's hot. And so eventually you're going to have to get back to something that explains it all, that's not being changed, but is the explanation for all change.
Yes.
So it's going to be changeless, and it won't have parts, because then it's going to have, well, how do the parts work? You're going to have to go back to a further principle. So it ends up being one, changeless, and it's going to be what Aristotle calls pure actuality, but it's thought, and it thinks about it's the highest things, which is itself. So it's divine, but it's static. So it's not doing anything, right? Because it can't change. Mm-hmm. It's simply knowing itself in eternity forever. And that's ultimately the explanation behind everything.
Yeah.
So that's Aristotle's God. It's not personal. But notice those assumptions. One is perfection, and they'll try to reduce everything to the one and reduce all multiplicity to the one and all change to the changeless. And even within the ancient cosmology of spheres, you have the same thing. So at the terrestrial level, this is the lowest reality, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It's imperfect. And so everything's changing. But if you go up into the first heaven, right, I guess that would be the ether or something like that. You get out of the atmosphere. Well, things are changing, but not as fast as things here. And then the second heaven and the third heaven, where you have the different planets, right, spheres. And what you notice is they'll say the fixed stars, right, or the back. Like, so you have when they say movable stars, they're really referring to the planets, right, that are going around. But behind them is the fixed stars, right? So as you go up the spheres in this geocentric, concentric kind of universe, mm-hmm. It's supposed to get more and more perfect, right? And ultimately, out of the seventh heaven would be the one. Absolutely, like, doesn't change at all. And unlike the fixed stars where there is no multiplicity, it's just one. And that's what explains the motion of all the spheres and different stuff like that. And as you brought out too, that even ties into the notion of time, because for the ancients, time is cyclical, it's eternal. Right. So for Aristotle, there was no creator. There is the cause, which is God, which is not a person, but is self-thinking thought and pure actuality. And it's the cause of all motion, but it doesn't move. It's the cause of all things. But those spheres, the material universe has always been there. And it's just, so time is just cyclical. It's the eternal return. And we'll see that orthodoxy breaks from that in two important ways. A denial of the classical Greek metaphysics and antiquity, that one is perfection and immutability is perfection. So in God, there's dunamis. Right. In God, there's multiplicity. And this problem going back to the one and the many, in which the one is always put first as an explanation and the many are always reduced, orthodoxy breaks that dialectics of opposition there by saying they work together. Right. The one is not, in Orthodox theology, is not above the Trinity. And in fact, if anything, it's reversed. The way that we start is not with, and our kind of like, if there was an Orthodox metaphysics, with one ends up being the explanation, because then, like the Scholastics and the Greeks, we would actually put essence first. We explain God first by essence, and then you tack on persons. Mm-hmm. But in Orthodoxy, we start with, how do we know what God is? God's one, right? One God. but in three persons. How do we know the one what? Through the three who's. Right. So it's person that comes before. It's Trinity that actually explains the whole universe. Right. So it's the triad that's in everything and explains everything. That's actually our metaphysics. So it's actually reversed from the Greek metaphysics, is that it's not one that explains everything. It's triad that explains everything.
Right.
Man is made in the entire cosmos in triad.
Which highlights that orthodoxy is beginning with particularity and moving towards the multiple to the unifying, or the essence of God. We know the essence of God through the three persons of God. And I always bring this up. I think it's so interesting that Pythagoras talked about how 3 is the first number of multiplicity. And of course, our God is three persons, so it's one essence and it's multiplicity. It's in the Godhead, it's one and the many. That orthodoxy is saying that no, this tension, this eternal tension that the Greek mind, Plato, that the realm of the forms is ideal, and all this multiplicity is sort of illusionary. This is a misunderstanding. This is sort of haphazard. That no, they go together. This is sort of a symphony. They go together, and we actually know the unity through the multiplicity. It's not a diminution. It's a both and.
I'm trying to remember. What do we got here? It might be in this book here that I mentioned in St. Basil. By the way, this is Losky's The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, where there's a really good quote from St. Basil discussing the triad. So, and I'm only bringing this up because it's going to hit exactly on what you actually said. The ability to resolve the dialectical tension of the one and the many that's in the Greek. So if everything was one, we couldn't understand.
Right.
Correct?
Yeah, because there's no distinction then.
There's no distinction. But if everything was explained in terms of dyad too, then
there's no completion.
There's no, and there would be no knowledge either, because you'd actually, so dyad, two-ness is difference. That would be like, this is different than that. But remember what I need for knowledge. I need both of them. I need to see how are all those trees both one and different.
Yes.
So if it's all reduced to monad, I can't actually understand anything.
Right.
I can't understand difference. If everything's reduced to dyad, then I can't understand unity.
Right.
So it's the triad that completes that.
Yes. No, that is, yeah. Keep going. I don't mean to cut you off. Keep going. Wherever you want it.
So it's able to, especially in the Trinity, so that there's 3 in 1. So they're all the same. But if it was just 2 in 1, then I wouldn't be able to actually resolve that, the difference into the unity. But it's the third that completes that. Right. And that's what St. Basil actually talks about. And so it's actually triad that explains everything, explains all knowledge, explains the Trinity. I wish I could find this quote. It's really good.
And this is a unique claim in world religion. This is where Christianity kind of stands alone in the theological assertion that God is both 3 and 1. Whether you look at these radical dualistic worldviews where you have, again, the dyad, as Father Deacon's talking about, to sort of continual eternal tension, or maybe there's a sort of resolution in the end or something, or it's all monistic. Our theology as Orthodox is claiming a Trinitarian, a triad of reality itself, which is clearly why then God would be a triad, because the triad is the key. It's the epistemological key to understanding what reality is and how it works. Did you happen to find that quote?
There's so much good stuff in here. I'm trying to find the. Okay, this might be it here. not finding it. Oh, maybe it's right here. Hold on. And what's interesting is he ties it into nature itself, exactly everything that we were actually talking about.
Right. And so just like we come to know the essence of God through the particularity of his three persons, we can come to know the world, or these substances that lie underneath the multiplicity of forms, by our experience and interaction with the multiplicity, with the particular in the world. The ancient Greek mind was really having problems with this. And so maybe you can speak to how Orthodoxy really deals with this idea, whereas in the school of Scholasticism, post-schism, this concept of simplicity really begins to destroy this multiplicity and unity or singularity, where they're both and so Scholasticism and some of their presuppositions, again, really focusing on Aristotle and some of the Greek stuff, they start to make a move towards simplicity. And this is where we could see the Western theology really diverge from the Eastern theology, and this gives a fertile ground for the philosophical trajectory of metaphysics itself.
And all the heresies are because of this, too. It's attempting to reduce the multiplicity to unity. I just read a quote here, whether, it's the Filioque or Origenism or anything like that. They all seem to start from this false. So I'm saying it's all about your metaphysical presupposition.
Yes.
If you have a false metaphysical presupposition, then when it comes to your theology, you're going to work out into a heresy. So that's, somebody might ask, like, why is that important? I'll just read you this. For the creature, subject to change by nature, can by grace attain the state of eternal stability, can partake in the infinite life of the Trinity. So, by the way, he's just referring there, breaking that dialectical tension between that, again, perfection is supposed to be stasis. And yet we're able to be brought into, and I'm trying to remember what the Father's, an ever-moving rest. Do you see that the words are brought together, where it breaks
orthodox.
Yeah. This is why the church has defended this so vehemently, the mystery of the Holy Trinity, against the natural tendencies of the human mind, which strive to suppress it by reducing the Trinity to unity. Interesting. And making an essence of the philosophers with the three modes of manifestation. By the way, this is what leads to modalism or Sabellianism. Right? Oh, I've got to reduce the three ultimately to one, is that the one has priority over the three.
Right.
Or even by dividing it into three distinct beings, which is another form of kind of reductionism, as you find in Arianism.
Yep.
So all of these heresies can be reduced to that the one is supposed to have ontological priority over, and we've got to, no, we don't. And part of this, I think it's important that we're bringing all of this up, is that this is all, what's the word I'm going to use? Autonomous epistemology. It's all starting from our minds and the way that we think things got to work, and we construct a system and a story.
Right.
That's what we've been going over this whole thing.
Right.
You have a bunch of people who are high IQ telling a bunch of stories, and they're all different, right? And they're all fundamentally retarded, right? Stories. It's just they don't sound retarded because they use eloquent of language in their high IQ, but they're wrong. They all can't be right. Mm-hmm. And we're all blind, right? That's the problem. And we're all trying to be like, well, it's almost like the Hicks thing about blind man describing God as the elephant. Well, It really is blind. In one sense, that's actually true. That man is blind. Autonomous man is blind, and he's trying to describe reality. And everybody's given a different story. The only thing I would deny is they're probably not even touching the same entity, right?
Right.
Or the elephant. They all can't be right because they're all different stories. But then one who is in a position to know solves man's problem, both epistemically, and the most fundamental problem is you're going to die, and you can't actually solve that. And he bridges that gap, that gulf, and he provides eternal life, and he provides knowledge that is the light of men,
right,
in the darkness, right? Is the prelude of John, actually the beginning of John. The Gospel of John talks about. And so notice that's what Orthodoxy is saying. Here is what reality really actually is. It's not unity first. It's not universals this and not universals here, nominalism, causality. It's triad. It's the Trinity that is in the entire universe, behind the universe. It's the thumbprint in everything. It's the divine energies and that's where we start.
And that energy differentiates this idea of divinity being static. Because at the same time, we're saying God is, in a sense, the essence of God is static, but we also separate that and say he's also dynamic in his energies.
Yes. So notice how they go together. And that's why even when coming to why is this important with regards to a theory of time is that time is in the Greek metaphysics an imperfection. Why? Because it's change. It's division. It's not the one. It's composition and these different things. And therefore, we've got to, in Greek metaphysics, reduce the imperfect and the multiplicity to the one, the circle. Mm-hmm. So time's ultimately cyclical. It's ultimately behind it is one. You get with a break from that, I guess, with Hegel and some of the moderns of time is linear, progressive, right?
Yes. Well, process. Everything is a process.
It's process. It's going, to fulfillment or whatever.
Sort of the full realization of the absolute self or spirit.
The spirit,
or Geist. Yeah, the gist of creation.
Well, Orthodoxy is not that. It's not cyclical. It's not linear. So those two themselves are, and these are not devil horns. I know somebody's going to... Okay, two. Just, I know somebody's going to be like, exposed. Father Deacon using devil horns. Not devil horns, just two fingers. Those are dialectics.
Right.
Well, it's either cyclical or it's linear. But orthodoxy is eschatological. Mm-hmm. And what you have is, just with the law, is that the chronological time and created fallen time, discrete time, right? Finite time, it's not done away with. It's made new. That the infinite and the finite come together. They come together in the liturgy and they come together in the eschaton as well. The law is not abolished. It's made new. Mm-hmm. All of time is made new. It's not thrown out. Mm-hmm. It's brought together and it's synthesized.
Right.
And the only way they can do that is in a triadic formula, because the two is opposites. The one can't explain distinctions. And so both eternity and finite world, God and man themselves, are brought together in the triadic formula. And only do you get that in the revealed metaphysics of orthodoxy.
Right. So getting back to that sort of the cyclicalness of time versus the linear stuff, again, orthodoxy is always both and so there's a beginning point to creation and there's an end point to creation. And the Alpha and Omega, Christ, when he comes at the second time, it's also we enter into eternity. And so it's both eternal, cyclical, if you will, and also linear in that there's a beginning, a middle point, and an end point. And
yeah, that's a good way to put it, is that completing that dialectics. So St. Maximus says the beginning and the end come together.
Yeah.
Right. I think you find that in the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ. Yeah, right here. You'll find that where he talks about, but is it simply cyclical? No, the cyclical can't plan. Well, there is a linear progress, right? We're going somewhere. We're going to the end. But it's not just that. The both are brought together because they're both subsumed under an eschatological notion of time.
Yes.
In which is fundamentally kairotic, because chronological time is an either or. It's either present or future. It can't be both. It can't be a both and. But in kairotic time, which is always applied in the Greek New Testament to God, and is what I begin with the liturgy, it's time for the Lord to act when we're praying, the priest and I are praying. That's kairos. Kairos is not chronos. It's not chronological. So that means that not only can present and future be one, they're always one. This is why we talk about in the liturgy, the already not yet. The future is already happening in the liturgy, but not yet.
Yes,
so you do that kind of eschatological kairotic notion of time doesn't do away with the cyclical or the linear. It brings them together and it synthesizes that. And there you have a Trinity.
Mm-hmm. So moving from there, let's move forward in history, that we see then the Duns Scotuses of the world, the Thomas Aquinas, the William of Ockham, that the scholastic tradition then posits actus purus or pure simplicity, and really moves away from this theology of the Orthodox Church, which is established by the Church Fathers, Cappadocians, as you mentioned, Father Saint Basil. So can you lay out then maybe some of the problems of the metaphysics of the scholastics, which give rise to really Descartes questioning that whole project itself and really developing the cogito ergo sum, this dualism and this focus on thought, which is really going to lead into Spinoza and Leibniz and then eventually Kant. So speak a little bit to scholasticism, their philosophical project, how that differentiates from orthodoxy and sets a sort of fertile ground for what's going to follow in history.
Yeah, and I think the fundamental problem can be traced to a theonomous epistemology. I'm trying to do it on my own, apart from divine revelation. I'll just read you something real quick from what I wrote. Let's see. I think it's here. What in the world? I want to open because it's a quote from Tristram Engelhardt. Let's see. Christianity did not begin in the arms of philosophy. Christ did not walk through Palestine preaching natural law. The early church was not a philosophical seminar. The apostles did not embrace the bonds of fides et ratio, faith and reason. The Christianity of the first half millennium marginalized pagan Greek philosophical faith and reason. This Christianity turned to Jerusalem, not to Athens.
Yes.
Although this church took terms and distinctions from pagan Greek philosophers, it did not ground its theology in their philosophy. So we were talking about, that's a great quote from Englehart's After God, and talking about metaphysics, which is a first things first. What do we put first? It's not that we don't do philosophy, as Engelhart points out. We take, our church fathers learned Greek philosophy. We make many distinctions we use the terms hypostasis, right? And we give it kind of further distinctions into persons and prosopon and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But what comes first? Jerusalem, our faith, not Athens. And that's what I typify scholasticism, is an embracing of the Hellenistic philosophic project.
Yes.
Putting that first.
Right.
That casts Christianity a new light. It takes on a new kind of way, an identity foreign to, as Engelhart puts, the first millennium of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church and our apostolic faith. And so when you start with, and this is what you see in Aquinas in the scholastics, is, you know what we should find? We should find blind man who's making up stories about reality, and we'll start with that. And then you know what we'll do? All that theology stuff, let's crunch it into blind man's stupid mythological philosophical stories about. Right. And then everything will work out, guys. Like, that's what's going on. Like, whose brilliant idea? I can just picture the devil be like, you know what you should do?
Yeah, I know, right?
Go find blind man over there. He's making up stories, right? That's what you want to actually put first, and then throw your theology into blind man's stupid mythological stories. Right. Things will work out great. And that's what you get. Now, to be fair to Aquinas, and I talk about this in another paper that I'm writing, is that I do believe that Aquinas is doing something of autonomous epistemology, even though he's going to admit nobody would be able to know anything unless there was a God.
Right.
That is not his first things first, though. He actually allows for secular pagan man to speculate about what metaphysics is, even though, and this is what I always say, the problem is you're putting the metaphysical horse before the epistemological cart. Is that right, or did I get that backwards? So it should be the epistemological horse, right? I can't make knowledge statements about, well, this is the way things really are, without actually knowing that I can know stuff, right? Be at least justified in that. And then, so what do? Well, how do you know? How can you be justified in making those metaphysical claims about the world? That ultimately this is the arche, or this is about forms and stuff like that. Because you are making knowledge claims. Right. What do? They do this viciously circular. Well, if my metaphysics is true about how the world is, then doesn't it justify my epistemological claims? That's why I'm saying you're putting your metaphysical horse before the epistemological cart, and it ends up being viciously circular. Right. It's like, well, wait a minute. Well, how do I know that that's true? Well, just grant me all my assumptions without actually having to justify that I know anything or can know anything about what I'm making about my metaphysical statements. And then I can know what I'm making about my metaphysical statements. It's like, you can't do that.
Yeah,
it's like it's epistemic bootstrapping, right?
Yep.
So this is the type of autonomous project that Aquinas and the scholastics are engaged in. We can actually start there, and we don't have to actually justify anything, because if you just grant it, then if it ends up being true, which you can't question because you got to grant it, then it'll prove my case. Now, ultimately, that's for Aquinas going to end in scholastics. God is the cause,
right,
for all the truth and the ability. So if you ask Aquinas, like, well, if God didn't exist, could you make any of these statements? No, you couldn't.
right.
But that's something that's only granted later, that's concluded.
And
you start, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, and a lot of that has to do with their understanding of necessity and contingency. So they do posit the necessity of God for the contingency of the world to exist, which is how their understanding being. But this process, and when they begin to, as Aristotle, associate actus purus, pure act, to the essence of God, and really simplify God, they create a chasm. As in the Orthodox, we have this triadic theology where we can engage with his energies. We directly engage with God. Their focus on all this dialectical Hellenic philosophy then posits the simplicity of the essence of God, creates a chasm for, can I actually directly engage with God? And the answer is no, I only engage with an analogy.
Yeah, that's the way I always argue. If God is not immanent in creation, now they're going to say he is through the incarnation, but they can't coherently do that, because I only know God through my mind, through cause and effects.
Right.
I have no immediacy with God. And God is mediated through my idea. Well, if the eternal transcendent one that can't enter into any multiplicity whatsoever has created a world that's finite, imperfect, and multiple, there is, just like the mind-body problem, there is no relation between the cause and the effect.
Right.
So all that means is I'm just engaged in a fruitless causal chain in which, when I get to the first cause, it doesn't actually intentionally pick out the semantic content of God. It picks out my own idea. Like it's recursive or something like that. It's like self-referential.
Yeah.
Like I end up worshiping my own ideas rather than God, the creator.
Right.
And a further problem with this is that if we have our metaphysics starting with man in the world, in contradistinction to divine revelation, the one who's only in a position to actually tell us how things are, then even if the scholastics and Aquinas say that God is the cause of our knowledge, but only after one's established this fact through argument or demonstration. Now, notice what the problem is right there too. Well, how do I know that argument and demonstration work?
Right.
And only first by assuming that epistemology is true without justification, that knowledge is possible, right? That's the epistemic bootstrapping problem that I pointed out. But let's consider this further. What are the implications of such a metaphysics and such a move?
Right.
It means that the scholastics or any natural theologian must admit that someone can start from various metaphysical and epistemological assumptions.
Yes.
Because
without justifying them first.
Yeah. Notice that's what natural theology. We just all look at the world and we could reason that God exists, that he's one, that he's immutable, and these different things. Well, wait a minute. Everybody has different, as we've just discussed and seen, different metaphysical and epistemological positions and assumptions.
Right.
And we're going to say they can't all be right, but they can all start from different positions and be justified in reasoning to a correct conclusion. So we'll agree that, yes, the correct conclusion is that God exists. Okay. But that's not a good argument, right? Simply I can get you, and we've always made jokes about this. We could do an MK Ultra experiment where we drug you and get you to the correct conclusion that God exists. Nobody's going to applaud us and be like, fantastic, valid argument in justification be like, that's unjustified, right? We don't actually we want people to come to the right conclusions for the right reasons.
Right.
And if those reasons are all different, they all can't be right. That's one of the problems, right?
Right.
And so it's not going to constitute is good reasoning, a sound argument, or justification for even if they get to accepting a true conclusion. And it turns out that what one's metaphysics and epistemology is actually going to be important.
Yes, right.
And that they themselves are not only that they're true, but those metaphysics, as we've just seen and talked about today, will provide justification for all the other stuff and all the other reasoning processes.
Right. No, this is a great bridge point, because this multiplicity of presuppositions, where do we start with the presuppositions we assume? Descartes sees this, and that's why he becomes very skeptical. Well, I'm going to become skeptical and doubt everything until I reach the foundational bedrock of that which I can no longer doubt. And I'm going to
I was going to tie into that.
Okay, well let's go there next then.
Well, so what I think is that Aquinas sets up for this. So he's not obviously as radical and as autonomous in his epistemology as Descartes. Well, how does Descartes happen? Well, if natural theology admits that a person can start from different epistemic and metaphysical assumptions, starting point, and get nevertheless to the correct conclusion that God exists and be justified in that, then, well, guess what one of the metaphysical starting points of certain people might be? Atheists.
Right.
What's their metaphysical and epistemic starting point? There is no God. Now, if you asked Aquinas, could an atheist, from their metaphysical and epistemological presupposition that God does not exist, still give a reasonable account for reasoning? Could they actually be justified in getting at? Now, I would say an atheist still knows things, but from their worldview, can they actually notice the difference?
Yeah.
There's something different saying John knows X versus John can posit coherently that he knows X. Notice in the latter one, you actually have to have justification to say that I actually know this. So you have to appeal to certain metaphysical and epistemological starting points. Now, if John's an atheist and says, I can assert that I know because my principles are everything's an accident and there is no God, and therefore everything's accidental knowledge, accidental laws of physics, right, accidental identity, accidental necessity, right, accidental logic, you're retarded. That's incoherent. Right? But Aquinas allows for this.
Right. And that's exactly that fertile ground that's being set forth with scholasticism that allows the whole philosophical modernity conversation, that follows. So if that's possible, I mean, are you surprised that once modern man rejects objective essences and casts everything into doubt, that he believes in his pretended autonomy, that he can construct a Tower of Babel on his own and get to make heaven himself, and make himself God? By actually, Descartes would actually say, even if God didn't exist, I could still know. Because if you read the Meditations, now Aquinas would never be so bold to say that. Right.
But Aquinas sets up for Descartes and modernity. Because Descartes actually be like, no. Because what is in the Meditations? He gets to indubitable truth, assuming that God doesn't actually exist. So he's actually saying, God, not only do I not start with God and revelation, like Aquinas doesn't start with, he goes a step further and says, I'm going to actually assume that God doesn't exist, and I can still provide a coherent account of knowledge based on what? Myself.
Right.
That is totally autonomous epistemology. Right. So I hope that I made that clear and bridged that historical gap between scholasticism. Well, what did we do? Antiquity, scholasticism, and natural theology to modernity and Descartes. How did he get to where he got? Well, exactly how we described.
Yeah. And so now we have this, and Descartes, as you're talking about, sort of sets the framework for modernity moving forward in regards to the philosophical discussion. His dualism between mind and body, between the world. And now the conversation is, okay, let's follow the philosophical project of Descartes, and let's be skeptical of everything. Now, do we privilege the exterior or do we privilege the interior? And this is really then the dialectical conversation of philosophy moving forward. Which one is it? Is it the Anglo-American tradition of empiricism and materialism, or is it going to lead into the German idealism of the mind? Which one is it? And you can see it's all set forth, and it's fertile ground for this whole process to follow. And
then you get the dumbest move of all, phenomenology.
Yeah.
I can't stand phenomenology.
Oh, really?
Oh, we can't know that. Like, let's just bracket those metaphysical questions. And our starting point will just be the phenomenon.
Yeah.
And I read a really good refutation of it's really short, but in the Bonjour book here of phenomenalism, with regards to epistemology. So phenomenalism can't make any appeal to the structures of reality beyond the phenomena itself.
It really struggles with the universals.
But then he's able to show that inevitably it does. It starts making all these claims beyond what the phenomenon can actually, to ground the phenomenon. So it ends up being self-refuting too. And I think that this is going to play a terrible, it subjectivizes everything.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So let's move there then from Descartes sets this fertile ground for absolute skepticism and beginning, what can I not, again, in this question of being, well, what can I not be skeptical of? Well, I can't be skeptical of the fact that I exist. I'm a thinking thing, thinking right now. I know that to be the case. This is his epistemological foundation. This is the cogito. And so from there, like I was saying, we have then the exterior or the interior. Which one is privileged? Does the exterior form our interior world? Does our interior world form our understanding of the exterior world? And so this leads to Spinoza. This leads to Leibniz.
And he says that in the Meditations. And in fact, I think it's one of the chapters too, that my ideas are better known than the thing itself. And he goes through the wax example.
Oh, yeah.
Which is actually a really kind of cool, it's kind of fun argument to actually go through. But he's trying to, like, what's primary is my own ideas and not the thing in itself.
Yeah. The thing in itself.
So, because it's like, well, how do you identify something? Well, by its texture, its color, its shape, its odor, etc. So kind of the secondary qualities. Yep. And then he goes, well, you take a piece of wax that has a certain kind of shape and odor, and then you melt it. And he goes through all of those things that are actually changed.
Right.
Right. By which you would say, this is how I know it's wax. So, but then you still say that it's wax. So he's catching you in an argument that, like, you can't say that you know it by the empirical secondary qualities, because then when we change it all, you're still saying it's wax.
Yes.
So you can't have your cake and eat it too. So then he concludes that, well, it's because you know your idea. Your idea is more primary and immediate than the thing in itself, or the qualities and stuff like that. Well, that just sets the stage for, like you said, later philosophy to start saying, what is it that we know when we know things? You know your ideas, right? You're in your head, right? You never get to the external world.
Right. And to a degree, this is him dealing with the identity and change. He's saying, well, what is primary? The idealistic identity, the category I have in my mind, or the fact that I just called this thing a candle and it's gone through this entire process of change. And it's no longer the thing that it began to be, but yet I'm still calling it the same thing.
The same thing.
Therefore, What is primary is the mental category of me being a thinking thing. And so this leads to the monistic worldviews of Spinoza and Leibniz, and Leibniz's monadology and all this different stuff. And then let's get into Kant, because Kant is really a central fixture in this whole trajectory of metaphysics, where he brings in he calls it his Copernican revolution. So Copernicus moves us from man or earth towards the sun, and Kant is trying to say, well, my Copernican revolution is changing it from the object back to the self.
We need what's Van der White, where she's like,
oh yeah,
like we need a Price is Right like philosophy.
Yes. Well, I got my critique right here, actually. Critique of Pure Reason.
Is that Kitcher? What's the?
This is the Penguin Classic.
This one I don't. I've got a bunch of different Kant ones. This one is not my favorite translation.
Yeah, this is the Weiglet, Marcus Weiglet translation.
Yeah,
anyways,
that's the racist translation.
Yeah. So Kant then, just to try to set the stage here.
Well, we need to follow up. We need to set the stage because it's Hume that takes that.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Let's get into let's say Hume, because that's who Kant's responding. Because Hume is taking the opposite end of what Descartes just did.
Yeah, and Kant says Hume woke me up from my dogmatic slumber.
Yes. So explain to the people. So
Hume, he just follows it out that if there are no essences out there, there's nothing objective. That, and he follows, Descartes' skepticism and everything that was said after Descartes, then he's basically saying, well, if all you are restricted to the empirical, sensible world, there is no causality. You don't sense causality.
Yes. So Hume questions causality itself, and he's positing a more materialistic worldview. So he's going the opposite end of Descartes, and then he's questioning causality itself. This is confounding a lot of people. This is a major move in this philosophy.
And I think he might be the first one to kind of explicate the notion of I'm trying to like kind of a priori truths. And I'm trying to remember exactly the phrase that he uses. There's matters of sense, and then there's is it called matters of fact? I can't remember. There's things that would be just definitionally true. The whole's greater than the part. So he's already starting to get into this kind of analytic a priori stuff like that.
Yes.
And then there's empirical stuff that object A falls faster or is heavier than object B or something like that. And I think what he's able to show is that, well, your analytic a priori statements about like that's just kind of the meaning of the terms. I mean, that's not really knowledge because it doesn't correspond to anything.
Right.
Right. It's because that's the problem that you've got. You already pointed out, like, how does my mind correspond to reality? Right. So I'm going to have to go back to the empiricism that I got to ground my categories in reality. But the problem is if it all is grounded or begins with sense impression and sense experience, I can't know anything. All these things are just assumptions. I don't experience causality. I don't experience identity over time and these different things. So there's kind of just mental like fictions and stuff like that. And so you're left in utter skepticism that the future will be like the past, etc.
Right.
And so that was what Kant says, Hume woke me up from my dogmatic slumber. Because if what the predecessors said was true, then Hume is right. And Kant had never thought about that. He was sleeping. And he was committed to the kind of dogmatism of the predecessors, is what he was saying.
Yeah.
And then so he understands it, oh my gosh, he's right. That means there would be no knowledge, because knowledge requires causality. What did we see in the metaphysics? We're talking about causality.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about identity. If I can't justify those or secure those in any way, then I can't have any knowledge. And what's worse, or maybe not worse, it's on equal footing. I can't have science. Science requires causality, cause and effect. So I can't establish that. So that was enough to wake up Immanuel Kant.
Yeah. Well, and let's also mention regarding to Hume, so we also have the Copernican revolution, and then we have Newton. And so we have a new understanding of physics themselves, where people are now beginning to believe that the world is just a series of billiard balls going around and bumping into itself, and this is the world. And
yeah, that's what Descartes established.
Yeah.
Like abolition of essences, and then everything's mechanized.
Mm-hmm.
So it's now just forces, and you get this in Francis Bacon as well, and the scientific method and the Novum Organum, and that it's just forces now. So yeah, Newton comes in, but in order for that to be forces and vectors and masses and stuff like that, objects acting on other objects, requires causality. And Newton, who was a contemporary Kant, Kant realized the threat that Hume presented. Oh my gosh, we can't establish causality, then there goes science. There goes my boy Newton and his mathematic on the Principia and all physics. So he had to basically save that.
Right.
And one upshot of Kant is he actually does try to synthesize the dialectics. He's a transcendental idealist. What's the other? An empirical rationalist, right? He's trying to bring the two worlds together.
Well, let's get into so I wanted, because this leads into phenomenology and what are they studying? Well, they're studying this dialectic created by Kant, and that he's fusing in his transcendental method. And so Kant, responding to both Descartes and responding to Hume, then begins this differentiation between the noumenal and the phenomenal. And so the world out there in and of itself there's all these things happening. Look out your window. The world is happening. There's tons of phenomenal occurrences. Kant questions the ability to fully understand that. In a way, again, this is where Hume was bringing him out of his sort of philosophical slumber. He questions, can we actually know the world out there in and of itself? He would say no. And then he also says we have these noumenal categories that are essential for even the bringing together of the phenomenal and the noumenal. So he doesn't privilege one over the other. He says they go together, that they must be together. And this is a major shift in philosophy and in questioning how we come to know anything. And he even uses, a lot of people say that metaphysics died with Kant. I think I think Kant was very astute to the problems that were existing at the time. And at the same time, he breaks down metaphysics. He questions the ontological argument for God because of so that is, God is a necessary being. He necessarily exists. The cosmological argument that then the cosmos or the creation is contingent upon the necessity of the creator, which then leads to the teleological argument. Back in Scholasticism, those are the three main apologetic arguments: the ontological, the cosmological, and the teleological. Sure. Kant destroys those, showing that actually if you use the laws of logic, you can prove both, and therefore therefore this defies the logical propositions that you're saying are objective. And he actually creates what we call the moral argument for God with his categorical imperative. And so Kant wasn't an atheist. I've heard people it's like, did you read Kant? I mean, I understand he's very critical of everything. His critical method is transcendental methodology, but at the end, he actually makes an argument for God using his moral
Ethics.
argument. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now
So you can't do it from I mean, there's some good stuff about Kant.
Yeah.
That he questions all those presuppositions that were and falls out that, well, from those starting points, pure reason, you wouldn't be able to know, right? Why? Because knowledge can't allow for contradictories. And so those are the antinomies that he establishes. What is that in observation on the first antinomy, right? So he does thesis, antithesis.
Yes.
And he gives a perfect valid argument for both. And he just goes through each. Now, another good thing about Kant is not only is he questioning, and nobody really had kind of done it at that level, like question people's starting points and assumptions.
Right.
And so he's able to argue that, well, I guess that's what he's identifying as metaphysics. And he's throwing out metaphysics. And there's an easier book to actually read. It's of Kant. It's a shorter one, Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, where he actually talks about it. It's a great read. I recommend it. And it's much easier than the critique.
It's real small.
Yeah, it's like 100 pages, something like that. You can read it in a couple hours, not a couple hours, but
a day at least.
If you're like me, you could read it in 30 minutes and understand every word. So he thinks that he's throwing out metaphysics because he's identifying that as metaphysics, right? Those unjustified assumptions. And what he replaces it with is transcendental aesthetics, right? Whereas you, for the first time, you get a transcendental argument.
Yeah.
So he's really putting the question mark down farther than anybody has.
Yeah.
Oh, you want to talk about first things first? Well, your metaphysics can't actually justify that.
Right.
So let's get rid of metaphysics.
Or your full belief in reason itself. That's what his critique of pure reason, because other people would say, no, okay, let's stop with the skepticism. I'm just going to begin with reason. And he said, oh, really?
That's right.
That's what you're going to do? Okay.
So then he asked the important question that nobody had really asked. Well, what are the necessary conditions for the possibility of experience?
Yes.
And reason.
Yes.
Now, he didn't get to the correct conclusion in a fully coherent in a way.
Yeah.
But he was the first person to actually think in that transcendental mode of, well, wait a minute. We all just assumed, like you were saying, reason, that we could do these deductions and inductions and stuff like that. And nobody even questioned how that was possible. So we always assume the conclusions are established, the truth from the premises, but there's another way, a deeper way of establishing a conclusion transcendentally, such that if that's not true, then I can't do any discursive reasoning or have any experience whatsoever. Right. And that's an important contribution of Kant.
Yeah. Well, our tag argument is, even though we could point to, as Dyer highlights, Aristotle's sort of making that same argument of circularity to the sophist, but it's really Kant that brings the language to talk about the world and paradigms in this way. So he's very influential and important.
Yeah, exactly. And just like I started with, we're going to get some critiques, or people are going to say that, oh, you guys, you're just bringing orthodoxy in doing what the scholastics do and crunching it down into Kantian transcendentalism. No, we're not. And I'll go back to that quote from actually Tristan Engelhardt that actually said, what? This Christianity turned to Jerusalem, not to Athens. Although this church took terms and distinctions from pagan Greek philosophers, it did not ground its theology in their philosophy. I would say the same thing. Like I've always said, because every man is made in the image of God, it's impossible for any one person to be 100% wrong 100% of the time. People will say it's true stuff. A broken clock is what?
Right, twice a day.
Yes. So the fact of the matter is, that's what I'm actually doing. I'm actually noticing something that Kant says that's true. I'm doing what the church fathers. I'm taking terms and distinctions from pagan philosophers, non-orthodox philosophers. But I'm not grounding my theology in it. I'm just saying, because our theology comes first and it's the fullness of truth and faith, it's the faith of the fathers, it's the faith that established the universe.
Right.
I have an epistemic privileged position to be able to say, like, Kant is doing something correct there.
Right.
Hume pointed out something correct there. Aristotle did something correct there. Okay. And simply because Kant might be the first person to use the word transcendental argument, that doesn't mean anything, right? That's a word concept fallacy.
Right.
It's like, who cares the word? The concept was already present in that mode of thinking, right? Of first things first at the most fundamental level is embraced by the church fathers.
Right.
That's not Orthodox Kantians. It's ridiculous.
Right.
So that should put to rest all those objections.
Yeah, and that's very ignorant. And a lot of those people don't even know, they haven't read. Like, they don't. I get frustrated, with people that want to make criticisms like that. Or if you can point out true arguments from a lot of different people who, quote unquote, aren't orthodox. That doesn't mean that you fully support this person. I mean, what is this absolute thinking that if you highlight one person said something right, that somehow you're a full-blown supporter and student of that? What are you talking about? And so,
well, yeah, what's so silly is that they're so ignorant of the literature. I've seen people, they confuse the transcendentals in the scholastic sense, which is like oneness, being, unity, goodness. In Latin, what is it? Bonum veritas placerum, the good, the true, and the beautiful, is transcendentals. With transcendentalism, the literary, with Kant's transcendental asceticism, and then transcendental arguments for the existence of God. And
oh my gosh!
Next thing you know, they're going to be putting confusing it with the trans movement. So like when you start confusing, I'm like, all right, or just transcendental categories of reason, like the logical categories and stuff like that. A transcendental argument for the existence of God doesn't necessarily, you could have anything to do with starting with transcendental categories of the mind, of logic and stuff like that. You could make an argument, Jay often does. You can make an argument like Kant does from sense experience, from pencils, so people get that confused. They hear the word and they're like, oh, that must be what a transcendental argument is. No, it's a type of way of approaching things as a necessary condition for such and such.
So let's continue down this this road, because we really made a lot of ground. This has been a very productive conversation. For anybody, I know a lot of people are probably struggling to follow everything that we're saying, but we've moved from the Pre-Socratics to the Post-Socratics to Hellenistic philosophy into Orthodoxy, how it differentiates itself from the classical world, and then into Scholasticism, into Descartes' big question, and now into Kant and how he's, in his view, he's bringing together, the sort of Humean world and the sort of Cartesian world into one transcendental presentation. And this is very, very influential on what comes after him, which is German idealism. And so you get...
And by the way, we need to tell the audience, eventually what this all leads to, all of human history and philosophical thought, culminates in patristic faith. It's all resolved.
I didn't know you're a Whiteheadian process theorist.
That's right. Sorry for the joke, guys.
So then you get the German idealism, and like I said, so Kant is making this argument. We have, after Descartes, we have the exterior world and the interior world. Which one's primary?
It's amazing. Every time you mention something, like I just happen to be able to pull out the exact book.
That's great. I mean, that shows that we're not making all this stuff up. This is actually a real conversation on philosophy and metaphysics. And so then Kant, which one's privileges? Exterior or interior? He says, well, they go together because you have to have these a priori categories to have experience of the exterior itself. And that then really sets the ground for the Germans after him to just go more radical into, actually, we're going to just go with idealism. We're going to say that that it's really fundamentally the conceptual realm. And so we have Fichte, we have Schelling, Schleiermacher, and Hegel. I would say Schleiermacher kind of being the religious theologian of them all.
And Feuerbach, too.
Yes, Feuerbach.
Within the religious sphere.
It's through the... so you have, again, if we're going to understand this trajectory, you have Locke, Berkeley, Hume, moving towards what will become positivism, logical positivism. You have Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, which moves into
positive?
what will become idealism. I'm sorry?
Are you positive about that?
And so German idealism comes up with this concept then that everything is about the self and the full realization of the self, and that I'm a finite self. I'm a finite person right here, and I have a limited apparatus of what I can know in the world. And this is sort of the lens that I'm looking at the world. But then the world that I'm looking at is the sort of absolute self. And so somehow my interaction with this is the sort of monistic idealism of German idealism, which leads into, as you're talking about, phenomenology.
And we should also bring in, too, it leads into Marxism.
Yes.
As well. The kind of Hegelian idealism that's... Marxism is strange because it's both very reductive, but definitely Hegelian idealism, too.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt about that.
The idea of the state and the idea of man is what matters. Marx said some really crazy stuff. Like he was saying that the problem isn't with there's always, and you kind of have this dialectic too, obviously within Marx, but the problem isn't with God. The problem is the idea of God came out of man and became externalized as some separate entity. So notice the reduction, right? But there is this notion of it's just an idea, right?
Right.
But that it must be brought back into man. So man must become God because he's the origin of that thought. The problem is that it got externalized. There is, I think Marx actually states that that it's not the individual man. I'll try to find. So that's a good quote. Keep talking, because this is what it. Yeah. Obviously, the idea, German idealism.
Yeah. So I have a few things written down here on German idealism. So idealism is a direct reaction against the mechanistic empiricism and a turn to privileging the self. And they are continuing this Copernican revolution that sort of Kant started. And so, as I said, the key to reality is one's own self. The categories of understanding, these metaphysical categories of understanding consciousness, are the categories of reality. So they're positing reality. Ultimate reality is the categories that are inside your mind. And therefore, it's breaking down this distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal that Kant put forward. And this brings forward what we would call the phenomenological method, which phenomenalism is the theory theory, all we know is appearance. Phenomenology is the study of the appearances and how they're experienced. And so it's a descriptive method of describing phenomenon. It's not.
Oh, here's a great quote, actually.
Okay.
So not only is this with regard to the political state, but I would say nature itself, especially when you get into the phenomenology of spirit. But Hegel was intent on portraying the essence or idea of the state, and we could talk about the entire world, is grasped from within.
Yes.
So this is where this kind of process, right?
Yep.
Almost process theology is that, and Marx will play up on this too. There's no God out there that's the cause that's causing all of this. It's within, right? And when you start to realize and grasp this from within in the Hegelian dialectic of the synthesis and then resolution of that synthesis, you actually start to become actualized, the pure spirit.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was a great way of putting it.
So
he's on portraying the essence or idea of the state or anything being grasped from within. So that's going to that idealism there.
Yes, and that phenomenological idealism is a new sort of logic. It's a descriptive method describing phenomena. It's not a demonstrative method of dogmatic metaphysics like scholasticism. So they're in a new ball game. They're in a new realm. It's a new logic, a logic of process through dialectic. And so it's not a syllogistic logic. And it is a change is more ultimate than permanence. This is where, so then they move with Heraclitus, moving all the way back to this conversation between Parmenides and Heraclitus. The German idealists say, well, we're more Heraclitean than we are Parmenidean. And so it is an epistemology stressing direct awareness within which there is a gradual clarifying of ideas. This is a new metaphysics stressing idealism rather than materialism or dualism. Everything is mind or spirit or self. It's a developmental and evolutionary monism or an evolutionary idealism.
It's mind and will.
Yes.
That's another
Which
thing.
is you're going to see then where Nietzsche.
And that's all it is.
Yes.
That's all it means to be man, according to Hegel, is what is it to be a human? Mind and will. So there's a rebellion and rejection of nature.
And so this leads to, German idealism leads to a sort of immanistic philosophy, that the ground of being, the / divine being, is immanent in its entirety right here in the world. So this then rejects revelation. You see, German idealism and somebody like Schleiermacher is rejecting revelation as really symbolic, because the real thing that's going on here is that being itself, being idealistic, we are moving in a process towards the full realization of the self, the full realization of the mind, the full realization of the spirit.
Yeah, let me read this for you.
Yep.
In the process of history, this is according to Hegel, man is the being who increasingly expands in depth of personality to the point where he can consciously grasp the end of his existence and all of existence in man, which is to be a person and respect others as persons. Personality itself, notice, is totally redefined than from Orthodoxy. Personality itself is inherently infinite and universal.
Yes.
So there's the idealism. As a person, man is free. Freedom for a man is such, and not only for one or a few, is the goal of world history. History is, at its deepest level, nothing other than the actualization of freedom through the instrumentality of the modern state.
Yes.
And then swing it. No wonder you set up for Marx.
So let me bring this into Hegel real quick. So then phenomenology is a metaphysics described as gradualism. Everything is mind, spirit, consciousness gradually becoming. So as history goes forward, things are becoming more and more of what they idealistically are. And so for Hegel then, what is the full fulfillment of human history other than Germany itself, which is the state, because the state itself is the spirit expanded. And this is where nationalism takes hold of Europe, because there's a philosophy of this German idealism, of this process of becoming, that the states and the nations themselves are the becoming of the people who inhabit them. And so for Hegel, then the full realization of history is Germany. And then you can see the basis for maybe the Third Reich and where they get some of their concepts from. This is in German philosophy itself.
Yep.
So I have a few things written down then for, I put down the three main, other than Hegel, the other three main German idealists is Fichte. What makes our consciousness the way it is? He rejects dogmatic metaphysics, as did Kant. He wants a transcendental method, as did Kant. And he argues that the nature of self comes through a moral being. My moral life postulates the existence of a non-self. So absolute ego is the fulfillment of my finite ego, realizing, Father Deacon and Dr. Ananias is not me. He's my non-ego. My interaction with him, me knowing my own ego, is this process of the absolute ego, the absolute mind, the absolute self coming into being for Fichte. Schelling, he put an emphasis on aesthetics, emphasis on the feeling of nature one has with the ongoing theology. He writes about the philosophy of nature in terms of an evolutionary idealism. He's a romanticist. And so this is where romanticism is all about the feeling, the sensuous experience of the world. He argues that the physical world is at an early stage in its gradual evolution as living conscious spirit. Nature is a living force, impulsive, creative, bursting out with novelty. Same goes for his theory of mind. Therefore, reality itself is a vast creative drive, a will, with an emphasis on feeling, and the unfolding of the absolute is the cause of history. And then you have Schleiermacher, who then puts this all into a Christian German pietist framework where he objects to Kant's reducing of religion to basically ethics, because that's what Kant's categorical imperative, that's his moral argument for God, is basically saying, well, this is my argument for religion. It's a moral, ethical argument. Schleiermacher, German pietist, rejects that, and he argues religious experience is the absolute dependence on the divine, the essence of Christian piety. God is not another individual being along with us beings. God is not transcendent. So there is no up there. God is
Process
being
theology
itself. And so the ground of all being. So he's not following the realm of Spinoza or the pantheistic move. Everything is about relationships. The self that is being unified is the entirety of the network of relationships. And so for Schleiermacher, then God is this full realization of all relationships. I have a relationship with my social circle, with my parents, with my emotional relationships. All these different areas, these vectors of relationships create myself. God is the full realization of being itself, and it's here, it's imminent, it's happening right now, and history is moving forward to the full realization and revelation of what God is.
And that sets up for process theology.
And so that sets really forth this process in which you'll get Alfred North Whitehead really take that forward into the 20th century. But you can see right there in German idealism the roots of Romanticism, the roots of process philosophy, and the roots of phenomenology, all of which are going to then be different. It's going to break off and do different movements in regards to the question of metaphysics in being and how we experience the world. Anything you'd like to say regarding that?
It's kind of like Protestantism.
Well, it is. I mean, they were Protestant, right?
They were Protestant. Yeah, exactly.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well put. Yeah. That. And, what this, you also have, did we talk about, and again, you have these kind of pendulum swings, right? But then you get another kind of rejection of metaphysics, like with logical positivism. Did we talk about that?
No, so we haven't got in because that's the other side of this. Because the idea
am I skipping anything here?
No, I mean we're basically now into the 19th and early 20th century here. I mean, because the influence of German idealism, Romanticism. Maybe we can say a little bit about Nietzsche because he's totally rejecting metaphysics and his worldview. He's, again, God is dead, which I did a debate with a Nietzschean, and he brought up the whole God is dead line in the gay science, and I said, yeah, I agree with Nietzsche. I mean, he was right. Like, God was dead in the Western mind based on everything we just said.
Yeah, it's a great passage.
Yeah,
actually.
it's
very
true.
prophetic.
It's not, and so Nietzsche then, he's very versed in all this German idealism. He's then questioning this whole becoming process or this full fulfillment, because Hegel is really the last philosopher to create a grand system. There's no longer, and this is what postmodernism is, there's no longer a grand narrative to encapsulate all of philosophy. Hegel was the last one in this very rationalistic, systematic understanding of German idealism. That was his worldview. And so Hegel, you can see then the dialectic, the Hegelian dialectic of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. If I'm a German idealist and reality itself, being itself, is a process of becoming, which is really transcending into the full realization of spirit or the Geist, then that process moves forward through friction. That friction is my thesis and the antithesis, the opposite. And so this going and back and forth is how this leads to this synthesis. And the synthesis is the ultimate realization. Because it's monistic, there's ultimately no distinction between the thesis and the antithesis. They go together, which is a lack of distinction ultimately.
Here's a good quote from Zarathustra. Alas, my brothers, the God whom I created was human work and human madness, like all gods. And he goes on to basically start to conclude man should stop creating gods. And remember that Marx picks up on this too. Man should stop creating gods or creating metaphysics or any systems whatsoever, that it becomes externalized, yes. Right? So there is this whole critique of all of metaphysics, all of tradition, really all of reason. And if that no longer exists, what's the only thing that exists is will. That's what man is will. So then it's all the external stuff that supposedly got out of literally hand is brought back into control of man because he is God. Great. He's the only one that could, and that's the truth. Yep. So notice it's a reversal of the old world. The truth was external and your mind had to map onto it.
Right.
Then there is the rejection of God, the rejection of anything objective and truth, in the internalizing truth is what I make it.
Yeah.
Because I'm master and I am will.
And I'm in the process of becoming.
And I'm in the process of becoming. Yeah, I will become the masterpiece, right?
Yeah.
So that's very Nietzschean, and you can see how that's played out from the other, the predecessors, like how that's set up for that too.
And that well put regarding that will is sort of bringing everything back into control. This is what's going to lead to Jean-Paul Sartre and really the school of existentialism. And so he's going to build upon Nietzsche, and he's going to sort of be in conversation.
Nietzsche is an
right. He's just an existentialist before the term became its own school of philosophy.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so that's why he's sort of the inspiration for the existentialist school, and Jean-Paul Sartre, sort of the preeminent figure of that school. His being in nothingness is in opposition to being in time, which is Heidegger's response to all this stuff.
And by the way, this is totally satanic, just to let you know.
Yeah.
No, right? Because what is both Nietzsche and Sartre and the others, even Hegel, just from the quote that I gave from Hegel, freedom.
Yes.
This is the way you're enslaved. You're either enslaved to essences,
right?
You're enslaved,
or the category imperative for Kant. You're enslaved to this slave morality for Nietzsche. This Christian morality is a slave morality.
And even Kant thought that they're all using this term freedom, right? So even Kant, the reason why he came up with the categorical imperative, to explain his ethics is because if you didn't act on a maxim that you was universalizable, then you're enslaved to your passions.
Right.
You're making moral decisions based on what you feel, and that's slavery. And so he thinks true freedom is the categorical imperative. So all these moderns, they're all saying the thing, don't you want to be free? I mean, and by the way, I'll just make a shout out to, I have freed my slave, Chase, my IT person. He has been elevated to Ubermensch. He is now over morality, and he is finally free.
He's beyond good and evil.
Yeah, he is beyond good and evil, and we are just so proud of all your accomplishments.
Yeah,
we do want to give a shout out.
Shout out to Chase Mudd and all his work.
Yeah, and I wanted to also give a shout out that what was it? You guys probably don't know this unless you look on the photo on the website, but he looks like Casey Affleck. If you look at, yeah. So anyways, going back to this. Yeah. So what is the theme that you see? Sartre says man's condemned to be free. Right? Everything's reduced to free. Let's reject. This is why I call all these people neo-gnostic, right?
Oh, for sure.
God, you're bad, and the world that you create is all messed up. And if there's any problems, it ain't my fault. It's your fault and the way of the world. So what am I going to do? I'm going to reject it, and I'm going to build my own world, right? Under the theme of freedom, right? Well, what does that sound like? Well, he doesn't want you to he wants you, don't you want to be free? Don't you want to become like God, knowing good and evil? And the devil is always throwing these things. You should be free to do whatever you want, right? Pro-choice. All this stuff's totally satanic. Right. Like, you should all be realizing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for Sartre,
total trap.
For Sartre, he has this interesting philosophy that even you being a person, you're actually not a full being, because being, he believes, is sort of pointless and out in the world, and that whatever you direct your consciousness towards, you can only direct it towards that which you aren't. So if you're directing your consciousness toward being, that's signifying that you yourself aren't being. And
yeah.
And therefore the only
Heidegger's that way too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, let's speak a little bit to Heidegger, what you want to say, and then let's get into the logical positivists, which are sort of the other side.
I mean, Heidegger's a type of existentialist, right?
Yeah.
And he talks about the vulgar, right? The herd mentality,
yep,
and stuff like that. So he's all the existentialists are responding to this kind of German idealism too, yes, right?
Yeah, that's why it's so important. This move that.
Yeah, exactly. So Heidegger says that you're the Dasein, the being there.
Yes.
So in one sense, he believes that we're all enslaved from metaphysics and from all these. Why? Because we always start with our considerations of being with, so he has this ontic distinction. We start with particular beings to investigate the question of metaphysics, being qua being. He's like, that doesn't make any sense. That tree is not a being that's wondering about being.
Right.
And he says, doesn't it make sense to start with the beings whom being is a question for?
Yeah.
He's like,
touché.
That's the being there. That's literally in German translated Dasein.
Right.
The being there. That's you. So let's start with the being whom being is a question. And you have this kind of being precedes, existence precedes essence kind of thing too. Well, what are we? Well, you have to then look within oneself to find the question, and you are being towards death. You are the being who considers that you actually have an end, and that changes the way that you be,
mm-hmm,
knowing that you will be no longer.
Right.
You are a being in care, a being in anticipation. He uses these words and these very Kierkegaard will use a similar concept, throwedness.
Yes, thrownness in the world, yeah. Well, in William James, I believe, sort of talk about the buzzing confusion of the world. Again, sort of and he's a pragmatist, so again, sort of another off branch of all this stuff.
Yeah, so it's weird. Like Kierkegaard says, you live forwards, but you understand backwards. And
we didn't even talk about Kierkegaard because he totally goes with the school of Jerusalem and says, all you guys you're screwed. You need to just have faith in God, basically. His leap of faith. I tried to talk a little bit about that.
But Heidegger has this idea that you take your present and you throw it, right? So this is
the world.
Yeah, that you project it, whether that's anticipation, waiting for somebody to pick you up, waiting for death, these different things. You're actually creating, right, the mode in which you exist, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what gets him to actually conclude that being in time are convertible. All those things, care, throwedness, ready at handness, all those things are tensed, right? That's the way in which you exist. And you understand that through the Dasein. So again, it's this bringing the external world back into man in existence preceding essence.
Yes.
You're right. Yes. So that's a common theme too.
Yep.
And that's where your freedom lies.
Well,
yeah.
Yeah, existence preceding essence. That's it.
That's amazing. We're actually summarizing. This is really difficult philosophy. This is taking years to be able to summarize.
I know. Yeah, we just encapsulated the whole history of philosophy and metaphysics. And
so, what'd you do in your stream? Well, we just in 2 hours we encapsulated all of human history and thought in just a few simple words.
Yeah. So. Speak a little bit to, and we can wrap up here because this really kind of brings us to the contemporary period. Is we've now talked about the German idealism and its offshoots, which lead into existentialism, leads into Heideggerianism, leads into nihilism, and then we have the logical positivists who also in a way are sort of nihilistic, and you get the Bertrand Russells of the world, you get the Ludwig Wittgensteins of the world. Speak a little bit to the move, the philosophical move of logical positivism, and it's basically rejecting the mental categories, rejecting objectivity, rejecting absolute meaning, rejecting universality. Can you speak a little bit to that one?
Yeah. So, logical positivism came out of, it's called the Vienna Circle, developed, surprise, in Vienna, Austria. And you've already named a few: Karl Popper, Wittgenstein, Rudolf Carnap, A.J. Ayer, Thomas Kuhn, Russell being involved in some of that. But again, it's this rejection of metaphysics and a really kind of radical empiricism. But Kant kind of set up for this as well. Especially this is concerning like science as well. And so you have, and a lot of things are kind of coming together. So now you have this kind of new movement to think about like kind of language. So remember, Wittgenstein just thought that in the Tractatus that all philosophical problems were just ultimately semantic.
Yeah, word games.
Yeah, that we could just, if we just got our language correct, then we could fix everything. Like we wouldn't have any problems. Like it would all be. And so what that came to consider is that, well, then that means that there really is no metaphysics, right? Everything is just language games, like all truth and semantics. And so, but part of their project was an embracing of empiricism, that they had to somehow ground that in empirical, right? Because we got to get rid of all these metaphysical categories.
Right.
Let's just start with a kind of brute empiricism, and then we'll be able to explain this in terms of like a Wittgensteinian like language game. And so the logical positivists came up with a verification principle that was formulated by Ayer, that the only meaningful or true propositions are those, a principle only had a meaning if it could be logically verified. And the logical positive would further say that those statements and scientific statements and stuff like that are all based on the natural world. So you could retranslate that into the only meaningful true statements are those that could be empirically verified. So do you see what I did right there? I took the logical semantic and made a reduction to the empirical.
Do it one more time for everybody. Say that one more time.
So the principle of verification explicated and formulated by Ayer stated that something only had meaning if it could be logically verified. And statements can only be logically verified either based on logic or science if they could fit the observations, right?
Right.
If they could, hold on, I'm gonna fix my thing real quick. Go ahead. I was only getting in one ear your audio, and it was driving me crazy. So that means all logical and meaningful statements are only logical and meaningful if they can be empirically verified. Now, of course, this project came to an abrupt end when somebody asked the question, can that statement itself be empirically verified? And by the way, we deal with people like this all the time, and they can't get that. They're
well,
like,
I mean, and rightfully so to those people. I mean, we're talking about high-level intellectuals that fell into the same trap.
Yeah, that's why you see that your presupposition can actually blind you.
Yes.
To these different things. And so that was abandoned. You had Carnap had with his verificationist principles that, again, that propositions only have their meaning associated with a unique sensory data. Now, this is what's interesting about Quine comes in and overthrows that by actually saying, no, our statements face a tribunal. So it's a web of belief. It's not this kind of isomorphic atomism, one-to-one correspondence and different things like that. So this is where Quine comes in, and he brings in something interesting. And at the same time, you have Thomas Kuhn and stuff like that. Instead of thinking individualistically like this, like with the principle of verification and verificationalism and the old theories of meaning, that you're starting now to get certain concepts, and a lot of these guys are influenced again by Kant, paradigms, and that science operates on paradigms and the structures of scientific revolution and how those paradigms change, and that things are not just evidence, everything's theory contaminated and stuff like that. So there is some good that comes out of that we can learn from this.
Right. Yeah.
But it is an empiricism. And there's a whole movement, and it's still popular today as it goes into, and this probably catches us up to where we're at now, in philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, philosophy in general is naturalism.
Yeah.
Is that, well, ultimately we've got to ground all this stuff
into something
in empirical. But the problem is that what Quine and Duheim suggests or are able to show is the underdetermination of data thesis is that we can't do that. Every theory will be underdetermined by the data, meaning that we could get multiple paradigms or theories to all fit the observations. So I can't use empiricism to ground my theory and say that the theory is actually true.
Right.
And then you move into people to discuss. Let me find it real quick. Like Donald Davidson. What's another?
I'm actually not very familiar with him.
So this is some like epistemology stuff.
Okay.
There's a great.
Never read anything about.
We have Wilfred Sellers. There's another book here, Mind and World. John McDowell. I need to be more organized with my. The John McDowell is a good. Mind and World is a good book. I thought I had it right. So here's my Sellers book. You see, that's not even supposed to be remotely near Aquinas. That was the first sin that or Saints of the Prison. It's all messed up. And that's why I can't find. Mind and World. So here is a Kantian, and I learned a lot of this from my PhD advisor too, James O'Shea, who's a Salesian scholar. But that's the problem is, and it's almost this kind of return to like the Kant stuff, that you have the non-conceptual empirical stuff, and then I have theory. Like, how do I get the two together? And it's not like any of these people really solved it. I mean, they get good ideas and then somebody comes up and throws it out.
Right.
But again, what do we see through all this dialectical tension? None of these autonomous epistemologies or systems or brilliant philosophers are going to be able to solve this. They're always going to be stuck in these dialectics. And this stupid story and game is just going to keep going over and over again where somebody's like, I finally got it. And no, you're wrong on this, now this and this. And it just keeps going. That's the history of philosophy.
Yeah. And this is where the postmodern critique of the end of meta-narratives. Because if this is true, then idealism can't be ultimately true. Romanticism ultimately can't be true. There's just no overarching narrative. And therefore, what we're in with is relativism, subjectivism, wills the power. You have Foucault sort of, power, knowledge, that really everything's just about power. And I think to a degree, this is then the world that we live in. We're now in, the world of Kufid. We're in the midst of the Great Reset. And this is, if you want to talk about Nietzschean will to power, that's how we're being dominated by right now. We're being dominated by people, the global elites who believe in a sort of, they are the masters. We are the slaves, that there is no overarching meta-narrative. Therefore, they create the meaning of life. And they're going to make sure that they don't end, that their being is in a sort of process of full becoming, but they do it through a will of power. And so then it's so useful to have all of this foundational philosophy, even though we've said a lot, we used a lot of jargon, we said a lot of things probably people didn't understand. But if you were able to grasp it, you can see how then the world we're now butting up against is really the product of everything that we just talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what I argue. In my papers, The Dangers of Modernity and Technology, my Koof papers, my a lot of stuff I'm working on is like, we're in an age beyond ideologies and narratives.
Yeah.
Political ideologies, like that's gone, right? All that stuff's theater, right? It's all abandoned. That's for the slaves, and to make the appearance that things are normal. But the elites, the technocrats, they're beyond ideologies. Their ideology is power.
Yeah.
Now they may be involved. They may be religious. They might be occultic.
Yeah,
but you get what I'm.
Yeah, whether they're theistically occultic or whatever, some cathartic form of occultism.
Chase says I've been coughing. Yeah, I think I got the coof earlier this week, and so I feel better now. But like talking so much, it's getting it dry.
Well, here, have a drink.
So, yeah, I have a. It actually sounds good. I'm thirsty.
Yeah, so we can wrap it up here and just answer some quick super chats. But we really encapsulated so much in this stream talking about metaphysics. This was a very powerful stream that I think, again, for anybody watching, I'm sure a lot of people aren't going to grasp this on the first go around. You can rewatch, re-listen to everything that we just outlined, and eventually the more you deal with philosophy, almost, again, whether it be Kant or Hegel or so many of these philosophers, you never get it on the first go around. This is something you have to work on, and all of a sudden the word...
It's the slowest reading of all, like any subject you can actually do.
Right.
I just encourage people, as I do my students, when you come across words or concepts, if you hear us talking that you don't understand, write it down and look it up and just start making a glossary because they're going to come up over and over again. Half the difficulty is simply just new jargon, technical jargon, which is not something special to philosophy itself. Like, I mean, you can imagine, like, you know, hearing a biologist use the stuff for the first time, you'd have to look this stuff up. You're not going to get it on the first go.
No. And that's true for all of us, whether it be Father Deacon or Jay Dyer, myself, or any of the philosophers that we mentioned. None of them read through philosophy or any of these great thinkers of history, whether you think they're great or not. But either way, just dealing with the subject matter, it takes time. It takes practice. It takes work. It takes effort to actually love wisdom, to actually love the pursuit of knowledge and actually understand what it is they're talking about. And so don't get frustrated, but use this as fertile ground to, you know, make it a sort of side hobby. Maybe start reading, digesting a little bit by bit. And that can definitely help you and even understand then the beauty of orthodoxy, because for me, and I think for Dyer and you know, I actually never asked you, like, publicly, like, what got you into orthodoxy. For me, it was seeing this worldview up against the falling apart of my sort of philosophical worldview, and I just saw the beauty, the intellectual beauty, and obviously that's not the core of orthodoxy. So I'm not telling anybody that orthodoxy is an idea or it's a philosophical system. Of course not. But I'm saying that background of really engaging in everything we just talked about allowed me to see why orthodoxy is something different. It's unique in all of world religion and all of world philosophy. It stands apart. And this is part of the beauty. And this is then why you've created patristic faith and why we're trying to defend orthodoxy in the time that we're in right now. Because, there is no arching meta-narrative. And so everything's coming at every direction. And I love that what you've done and put together patristic faith is we all have different areas of expertise. We all have different angles that we're sort of standing. Orthodoxy is behind our back, and we're sort of positioned out towards the world to try to defend it.
Yeah, and you can read, I posted my conversion story on patristic faith. It's called The City of God and City of Man. And yeah, the way I found orthodoxy, I knew the ideas. I learned and saw the ideas through absolute suffering. That's how I found orthodoxy. So it means I'd been studying the ideas, but I couldn't understand them and see them until I lost everything. Wow. and reached that level of suffering. So you can read that, A City of God and City of Man, which was also published in Romania's most popular religious journal, Lumea Credenții. So it's on the site. Feel free. It's not a long article like the other stuff that I've written, 30 pages. I'm sorry. I'm going to try to do like shorter stuff.
It's so hard to write, like short and simplified. But I think we did a pretty good go at it today in regards to talking about metaphysics. I mean, that was a pretty encompassing discussion. So
yeah, that was awesome.
So anyways, thank you so much for being here and doing that with me. We got a few super chats. First one comes from Pano, or Orthodox brother here in the community. It says, what are your guys' thoughts on Christos Giannaras' ontology? I feel he's too heavily influenced by Heidegger's nihilism in the false attribution of evil to created nature and person as good, and it's freeing itself out of nature, but I may be wrong. Have you read any Christos Giannaras?
A little bit. I'm not well-versed enough to... I mean, there's things that I liked about his kind of rejection of Greek ontology and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I, to be honest, I'm the wrong person to ask. Like, if you ask me exactly where has he gone wrong, I don't know him well enough to his literature to say that.
Yeah, I am not. I have a few of Jan Ross's books: Postmodern Metaphysics, The Schism in Philosophy, and Freedom to Morality. And I was actually going to order Person and Eros, and I was reading excerpts from Against Religion, and he does have a overemphasis on being. So if you want to talk about his sort of Heideggerian influence. And I personally really like Jan Ross. I find it refreshing because having a lot of the background in philosophy, when you read him, it's orthodoxy in a sort of contemporary philosophical framework. In regards to his false attribution of evil to created nature and person as good, and it's freeing itself out of nature, I would need to know a little bit more on the excerpts of which book that is.
Yeah, I would have to. Exactly.
I'm not too familiar on that specific criticism of him.
I mean, I'd be surprised if he said that.
Yeah, I would be too. I certainly see a sort of Heideggerian influence is that he's really focusing on developing this concept of being in a sort of orthodox way. But he's clear that all the categories are objective categories, and so for me, it's everything I've read has been consistent with my limited understanding of orthodoxy. So I really can't answer regarding the specific criticism about false attribution of evil to created nature and person as good, and it's freeing itself out of nature. So let me know where you saw that. Read his book Enigma of Evil. He talks about that. Okay. Well, I'll have to dive into that and see what I think, Panos. But I appreciate the support and the super chat. Pano throws in another super chat, $3. Continuing, in other words, I feel Jan Ross seems to have a kind of monophysite, quote, self-willing or will to power in orthodox dress despite his good intentions, which is some baggage I feel a lot of Orthodox converts have from their Western upbringing. Now, have you read this one, Pano? The Freedom of Morality. I don't see him as overly a sort of Orthodox will to power per se, but again, I'd be interested in regards to which book you're talking about specifically. But I don't know if a monophysite, self-willing, or will to power in Orthodox dress. I'm not totally sure about that. I mean, he does talk a lot about willing and being, but a lot of it has to do with the willing one's will with God's will, and that is.
And we also have to be careful too. It's really easy to fall into. We immediately want to categorize that, and it's good to do it. As I was reading through the Losky and stuff like that, of what is it that Arians, the Greeks, and Origen and Sibelius all have in common, right? This reduction to the one, and the one, like, it's good to do that. Or there's an influence of monophysitism in something like that. But at the same time, we have to guard ourselves because we have a tendency to want to actually maybe prematurely do that and get it incorrect, that we think we're making connections that might not actually be there, because we want to, and it's a good thing, to be able to kind of categorize and be able to explain as like what's causing them to actually think this way.
Right.
So I've caught myself making those mistakes where I'm like, that wasn't actually, they didn't fall into that category. I was mistaken. And I certainly see it among other people. So I'm not saying, Pano, that's what you're doing, because I'm not a scholar on his work. So I can't actually say, and don't want to until I could get further into that. But just know that we should have a precaution going into anything, that we have a tendency to kind of actually want to do that and can make mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do it myself, and so it's like you want to identify things, but we also have to be careful that we're not forcing jargon and language into the categories that we've already formed, because a lot of times when you get deep into this philosophy stuff, you have to borrow jargon and language from other people that maybe have a totally non-orthodox worldview, but you're using it in a different way. And again, I have no idea. He said it's the two books are Enigma of Evil and Relational Ontology. I haven't read either one of those. So again, I can't speak directly to any one criticism, but I've read a few books, and I've really enjoyed Jana Ross. And it is deep. It's not for a novice. This is really somebody with a philosophical background wanting to see how orthodoxy is engaging with the contemporary scene of philosophy. So, but yeah, thank you so much, Pano. And you may be very right in your criticisms. I am not sure.
Know. Yeah.
But I think that's a really good piece of wisdom, Father, in regards to just being careful, making, and that's another, just as Orthodox, if anybody else is Orthodox, let's just always give them the benefit of the doubt, even if they say something that maybe comes across as, oh, that's questionable, XYZ. Let's put a Post-it note there, mark it, and say, okay, but I'll give them the benefit of that. Maybe that's not what they mean, but let's at least highlight it and recognize it, and then so thank you, Pano. Well, Pano throws in another super chat. Thank you so much, Pano. Another $3 says, the semiotics of Kant's name is interesting. It's like a subversion of Emmanuel from Isaiah. It's no longer God with us or God in us, a.k.a. theonomous epistemology / ontology, but something autonomous. You are the root of all the transcendentals. Curious. I don't think Kant would go that far, because Kant, from my understanding, in the beginning of the Critique of Pure Reason, he's saying that he's going to limit the realm of knowledge to make room for the realm of belief. And so his
epistemological project, the Critique of Pure Reasons, for his ethics project.
Right. And so his real main, I don't see him as trying to destroy the epistemological ontology as something autonomous, or we ourselves are the root of the transcendentals. Again, there are many interpretations, but I say what he's doing is trying to limit what logic can prove and say you can't fully know that in and of itself, but it's very possible that they are actually real and it's all dependent upon God. But he's just saying you can't know that. And so what you can know is, using his categorical imperative, is that his project is trying to say, what can you know? And then what are logical and potential beliefs that could move the conversation forward. But what are your thoughts on that, Father?
Yeah, I mean, all of these guys are doing autonomous epistemology in one sense or another, even Aquinas. We just have to be nuanced in saying, in what ways are they? And again, there's good things that each of these philosophers have contributed and pointed out. Mm-hmm. And there's also things that are problematic and set up later, as we've seen, for further problems. Yep. But I don't particularly feel that Kant is the rebellious modern.
No, yeah, I don't think he is either. I think he's trying to make a move. He wants to salvage God. He wants to preserve. Now, again, it's overly rationalistic. It has a lot of things in as Orthodox we wouldn't support, but I don't see him as you said, like the great rebel against God or against. He's just trying to question what it is that we know, and based on the presuppositions that they brought to the table because they rejected revelation, I think he had some interesting and accurate things to put forth.
Yeah, and he locates, I mean, it's debatable, but I definitely think that Kant is a theist, that he locates God within the noumenal realm of freedom within morality. Like, that's where you have access.
Yeah.
He's just saying you don't have access to God through reason, which we would agree with, right? Not for the same reasons.
Right. Yes.
But there's a sort of kind of immediacy within the noumenal world of freedom within ethics that doesn't have to be mediated through reason. And I mean, that's a good thing, right? That it's like, if that's where we find God, I don't have to use these kind of categories and cosmological argument. That's not how I get to God in Orthodoxy. It's not how I meet him. And so there's some similarities and parallels. Yeah.
Yeah, I think really well put. So thanks again, Pano, for that super chat. Christina throws in $5, says, God bless you. Well, God bless you, Christina. God bless you and your family. Hope everybody's doing well. And you are off to a great start of the new year, going to conquer 2022. Pano throws in another super chat. Thank you very much, Pano. $3 says, in 1053, a monk from Mount Athos prophesies that Germany will play a crucial role at the end of the world in the spread of orthodoxy throughout the world. It's why we should study these topics closely, like Father Seraphim Rose.
Nope.
Yeah. Interesting. I wasn't aware of that prophecy, and I'm not sure how to interpret that, but potentially. Certainly in regards to philosophy, there's probably no one single greater influence than all these German philosophers. Next super chat comes from Lynx. It's our last super chat. Throws in $5 and says, what's a good introductory book recommendation for curious slow boys like myself regarding philosophy and metaphysics? God bless.
Oh, that's an interesting question.
I got one book. Let me grab one. So, links in regards to easy books or introductory books. Unfortunately, there is no just easy intro to these topics. Yeah. This is a great overview. This is called An Introduction to Metaphysics by Jean Grandin, From Parmenides to Levinas. I would highly recommend this book, but it's not easy reading. Again, you're going to move through it very slowly because he's basically just breaking down each philosopher, but it's dense. Every sentence, every paragraph is dense with meaning. So this is a good introduction, but it's not the easiest thing in the world, that's for sure. Also, I would recommend, if you're trying to grow your library,
yeah, how easy, like, you want it?
I'm a big fan of Father
Copleston.
Frederick Copleston's series. So if you guys can see.
Man, those are the nice. Mine are all like old 70s Copleston. You got the new.
I did. I went ham on it. But this is a great set.
That is a good.
If you want,
that's really like a history of philosophy. Yeah,
exactly. So basically, what we tried to do in today's stream, this you can't really go wrong. Again, now he's a Catholic, but I really like his books, and this is a great overview. Man. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
His stuff's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. So
there is, like, if you want a really easy introduction, Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy, I think, is a pretty easy. Anybody can read it.
But so not I don't know of any easy book to just get into this topic. Again, what Father was able to do for us today, this is lots and lots of hours putting forward to understand and comprehend. And so if we do any ability to maybe regurgitate some of this stuff in a clarifying way, it probably took hours to be able to speak about something for 20 minutes. So it's very difficult stuff. So I'm sorry, I don't really have a good introductory book per se. Yeah, but that's any last comment for their Father? Yeah.
No, yeah, I mean, you could do Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy. It depends, like, how in depth you want to get. Like I said, the Copplestone's a great history. It's not super technical, but but it's going to take a time, a lot of reading to work through.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's no easy. There's no easy way to like you're saying. This stuff took me 25 years to, like, people see Jay and I debate, and it's like they want to do that immediately. It's like, I've been debating, and Jay's been debating for many, 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 many years.
Yes.
So it looks easy, but there's a lot of time that's gone into.
It's like having a great physique. If you see some great, bodybuilder or whatever, it's like that didn't happen overnight. There wasn't an easy entry point to just get that. It takes years of consistent practice for whatever. And that's the same thing true for all this philosophy stuff, or to do high level apologetics where you're talking about.
Or a beautiful.
Or grow. This is actually.
You think this just this just happens? It takes a lot of hard work.
So yeah, thank you, Links, for that. And then we got the great old Chase Mudd throws in $1 and says, "Why come Protestant?"
Why come?
That's literally what he says. Why come Protestant girls don't want to date me? Should I send them Kodal videos instead of Jay Dyer videos? They said he's mean.
Why come? By the way, that's Chase and I. That's our inside joke.
Oh.
Because I've been praying that that you only find an Orthodox girl. So stay away from Protestant women.
Yeah. Put your faith in God, Chase. Pray to Saint Xenia. Pray to the Theotokos. Saint Xenia and the Theotokos are definitely, if they could intercede on your behalf, you may just end up with an Orthodox wife before you know it. And
all in God's timing too.
Yeah. I mean, in a way,
and that's with anything,
mm-hmm. Amen to that. Chase Mudd said, Father Deacon has philosophy classes online you can buy. Would you like to tell people where they could buy some of your classes?
Yeah, and by the way, so I've been a bit slow on. I must have about 30 lectures, about an hour and a half. And what I had to do is I had to download those and back them up, because my school Zoom has deletes it over time. Oof. And then right now I only have, I have the logic stuff. I've got ethics and intro to philosophy. And I only have about, with the ethics and intro to philosophy, about 3 or 4 of those. But like I said, I have about 30 of them in total. I just need to upload them. Now that I've backed them up, I need to upload them, see if I should do any editing, if you guys like me to put the music on. But I'll organize that. I also have about 16 political philosophy courses. They're all just, which is an upper division. These are all university courses that I've recorded. And a lot of them, I'll give you my free notes and PowerPoints and different stuff like that. Wow. And package those in different deals. They're on Gumroad.
Yep.
And so I'll try to get on that. Most of my attention has been, like Chase and I have been working on the patristic faith, and just kind of me getting ready to start up school on Tuesday to start back teaching and stuff like that. But what I did do, and it took forever, is to back up all those videos.
Oh, I bet.
That was like over 60 videos just recently I had to back up before they were deleted.
Wow.
So they're all in my YouTube, unlisted, that I can actually then put them into courses. So I have it all there. It's all.
Wow. And
this semester too, I'm actually teaching a critical thinking class too. So I could, in the future, present that as a course as well. Mm-hmm. But.
Yeah, that's invaluable. Learning some of this philosophy stuff. It's kind of easier if you hear great lectures, or if you hear somebody lecture. And that's, again, we just broke 3 hours. I would say that's probably the most comprehensive 3-hour podcasts on philosophy on YouTube. I feel like we did a great job of trying to give an overview. So if you want to hear more of the sort of lecture style breakdown of all this stuff, which then you can dive deeper into books and maybe understand some of these categories, make sure you reach out to Father Deacon about you'd be interested in purchasing some of his lectures.
Yeah, or just write me too, and we can work out like a fee. It's obviously if you buy more, they're not going to be as expensive as the logic ones, because the logic ones require a lot of work, and there's a lot of materials that I've actually had to obtain to present. So the other ones are a lot cheaper, but yeah, like we can work out something. You can always write me and be like, this is what I can afford, and I won't be miserly with.
All right. Well, Father Deacon, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to let you go and potentially
God bless.
Do something more productive with your day. This was a great conversation. I'm sure a lot of people are going to appreciate this. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Is there anything you'd like to say to the people before hopping off here?
Just continue to support. We'll have Chase get this video up on Patristic Faith.
Yes.
For us, continue to support us in Patristic Faith, and we have a lot more great people in the lineup that we're not gonna announce who their names are. I like having these kind of surprises that we release throughout the week. Different materials, different people that we announce. It just gets better and better, and we need this. The world of Orthodoxy needs this ministry, and I feel really blessed that it's just been this successful, and that all of you have been so supportive, and so let's just continue to pray that it goes well.
Yeah,
and blessed by God.
In the face of chaos,
yes,
it's really exciting and sort of optimistic. And so,
I know.
Thank you very much for your work and getting everybody together and really creating a new hub for Orthodox apologetics. I'm really excited to see where it goes in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Who knows what it'll be? Mm-hmm. So God willing that we're all here to continue to do it. So thank you very much, guys. Please smash that like. And I will be back either Friday or Saturday or Sunday. One of those days, I'll be back with another stream. So until then, as always, God bless.
God bless.